6 hours later, Spock had analyzed the information so many ways that even he was losing track of the permutations. The results were discouraging. As if to underscore his lack of success, the bridge doors whisked open, and McCoy strolled over to the Science Council. "Well, Spock, how much longer are you going to twiddle your thumbs before you bother to locate Jim and the rest of the crew who disappeared in that window?" Spock continued studying the data on the screen in front of him. "I am not twiddling my thumbs, as you so picturesquely put it, Doctor. A race as ancient as this one probably did operate according to principles that we do not understand. This device appears to have been designed by creatures nearly as irrational as you." McCoy rolled his eyes toward the ceiling and started toward the door. "Sorry I asked." Spock turned back to his computer and realized that the artifact's shields might randomly shift frequencies. While such protection methods were completely logical, a society which used them on their public transportation devices was not. He wondered if the aliens were protecting themselves from outside invaders, or if their security precautions had been directed against their own people. Sulu swiveled his chair to face Spock. "Mr. Spock, we think there are 6 alien creatures near the artifact, but half of them are within the areas of maximum sensor distortion. Another creature has gone to ground in an area of extremely broken terrain, and we're having trouble pinpointing its location." Spock read the notations on the screen. The possible life form readings were scattered over an area with a 30-kilometer radius, centered around the second artifact. Spock leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him. It could hardly be an accident that the Enterprise was missing 6 people, and that their best estimates showed 6 aliens on the planet. "Lieutenant Uhura, notify Dr. Call that we will be transporting down to Site N4 at first light in that area." Spock resumed his study of the site. Which of the aliens should he contact? Near sunset, Kirk's host drifted to sleep, exhausted by the day's exertions. Kirk became aware of random images drifting through his mind. Strange, crab-like beings with translucent shells floated and tumbled past the rock spire where he was sitting. The creatures called themselves the Kilikt. At first, he was content to observe as they performed their aerial ballet for his benefit. It was only after many minutes, in dream time, that he perceived that the inky black splotches on each dancer's carapace were tiny anti-gravity units. The devices stood out in stark contrast to the rainbow hues of the Kilikt's shells. As he watched the colors flicker over their carapaces, he began to see patterns that repeated themselves over and over. The longer he watched, the more he became convinced that the Kilikt were singing. The color patterns and the timing of the changes formed the basis of the Kilikt language. In the language of movement and color, the history of the Kilikt civilization unfolded around him. From the first proto-Kilikt that emerged to conquer the land, up to the mighty builders who had ruled the known universe. As the history of the Kilikt civilization unfolded, the dance became more complicated, and the dancers' colors became brighter. To maintain the unity of their civilization, caste rules, language, and specialized motor skills were permanently imprinted on the lower brains of the young when they reached a certain size. Shaped by that defining event, the unique elements of each Kilikt personality emerged and were stored in the higher brain. Kirk realized that stepping into the artifact had transformed his body into that of a Kilikt, the only intelligent race imaginable to the device's programmers. At the height of their civilization, the Kilikt had lived on over 100 worlds. Some planets had been similar to the Kilikt homeworld, warm and lush, filled with abundant food animals and ripe for serving Kilikt needs. Other planets had needed much work, exterminating indigenous life forms, reforming ecosystems, or altering climates. the dance became a flashing, swirling, twisting maelstrom recounting the glorious conquests of the Kalikt people. Sorting through the flood of information, Kirk realized that he owed his survival as an individual to the Kalikt's unique bicameral brain. His human memories and knowledge were stored, separate and isolated, in the higher brain, while the lower brain contained the knowledge for functioning in a Kalikt body and using Kalikt technology. Under the force of his excitement, his dreamscape fractured into a kaleidoscope of images that whirled and gyrated around him. In the morning, everything seemed clearer, more sharply defined. Kirk let his mind swim through the remnants of his dreams, sifting and culling the chaotic images for the truths beneath them. If he could master the linkage between the Kalikt brains and find a way to cross the mental barriers at will, he could control his host body. The separation of instinct and intellect suggested that Kirk's extended flight across Karata 4's grasslands was a response to something pre-programmed into his host's lower brain. That thought brought images of the Kalikt's justice system into Kirk's consciousness. With a start, Kirk realized that his host, the Kalikt whose body he presently inhabited, was fearful of punishment and apparently on the run. And he began to understand why this host had been selected for him. When he went through the window, the artifact could not find a template for a dominant male and had apparently settled on the closest available model, a convicted felon. It was an unsettling thought, but it at least explained his circumstances. His next step, Kirk decided, was to test his new insights by convincing his host to return to the transit frame. Getting water would be the first test of whether he could order the Kalikt body to do his bidding. With the image of a refreshing drink of water firmly in mind, Kirk tried to move from his hiding hole. At first there was no response. Remembering what it felt like when his arm fell asleep, Kirk shuddered at the idea of having pins and needles in 8 legs at the same time. He returned to his experiment of the previous afternoon, concentrating on bringing his pincers together and slowly lifting an appendage to eye level. This time, he got a response. Kirk threw himself into mastering his Kalikt body, imposing his will on nerves and muscles paralyzed by the long inactivity. After 15 minutes, he could still move only 1 set of pincers or bend 1 joint, and he was beginning to fear that he was trapped. He kept trying, knowing it was the only way he could escape, and finally, his perseverance was rewarded. Apparently, his muscles needed to reach a critical internal temperature before they would work. With relief, Kirk dragged his Kalikt body from beneath the slab of rock and struggled to stand. By the time he reached the mouth of the narrow canyon, Kirk felt reasonably confident of his ability to manage the Kalikt body. The stream was muddy and unappealing, but Kirk decided he didn't have much choice for available drinking water. Before he could act on the thought, his lower brain took over, bending his knees until his jaws were resting below the water. The water was tepid and bitter from dissolved minerals, but his sediment filters removed most of the suspended grit and clay. He allowed his body to drink until it could hold no more water. Next, he needed to get back to the artifact. Kirk looked around, assessing the canyon for routes to the uplands above. Reluctantly, he started downstream away from his goal. Somewhere the canyon walls would flatten out, and he could climb up onto the surrounding hills. A sharp wind was blowing out of the east as the Enterprise's landing party materialized on a hill at Site N4. Signaling to a security guard to accompany him, Spock started downhill along a band of flattened grass. He had decided to contact the individual closest to the artifact to learn if he could communicate with the aliens. After that, he would attempt to contact the being who was hiding in the Canyonlands to the northwest of the artifact in hopes that it was Kirk. Although the justification for this decision, that the captain would react differently than the rest of the crew, was weak, he had not found a better reason for choosing which alien to contact. One of the aliens was over the first hill, moving in slow, random zigzags that had kept it in the vicinity of the artifact. Spock and the guard with him approached the alien cautiously, giving it plenty of time to see them coming. At first, it gave no indication that it saw them. Instead, it continued to amble along as though it were the only living thing on the planet. Fascinating. It appears to be looking past us as though we are not here. Ensign, cover me while I move in closer. The guard trained his phaser on the alien while Spock moved beside it. Even this failed to produce a response until he stepped directly into the creature's path. Then, inexplicably, it froze, its limbs locking beneath it. Spock to Enterprise. Lock onto the alien, who is at these coordinates, and beam it aboard. He stepped back from the alien, and the transporter effect coalesced around it, dissolving the creature into golden sparkles. Spock waited for the ship to request additional instructions. Finally, the instrument chirped to life with Scott's voice.
Mr. Spock, we had a wee problem with this beastie you had us transport up. It went berserk the moment the transporter released it, and it cut up Mr. Kyle fair bad before we could stun it with our phasers. But the critter didn't take too kindly to our phasers. It died.
Mr. Scott, your phasers should have been on stun setting.
The weapons were on stun setting, Mr. Spock. Unfortunately, we failed to communicate what that meant to our guest.
Spock knew that the stun setting should not have been lethal to any being the size of the one they had beamed to the Enterprise. Why was the alien dead? Mr. Sulu, status report about the other aliens.
Of the remaining aliens on the planet, 4 are approximately where they have been all along. The alien that was hiding in the Canyonlands is moving, but we don't know why.
Continue monitoring the aliens. I shall continue my analysis of tricorder and sensor readings. Mr. Scott, beam me up. Three hours and countless dead ends later, Spock wondered what they had missed. The sensor logs contained more information than he needed, but he could not reduce the data to anything useful. The effort he had put into unraveling the secrets of the alien machinery implied that they had used extremely sophisticated security measures. Suddenly, Sulu interrupted his train of thought. Mr. Spock, look at this. The main view screen showed the wavering shape of a crab-like creature attempting to scale the 10-meter scarp at the top of a landslide. The crab-like body was not suited for climbing, yet the creature chose its handholds with a caution that spoke of much practice. Spock wondered if it could be Captain Kirk. He remembered how many times the captain had asked him to go rock climbing. Watching the crab-like being attempt to scale a cliff that it was in no way equipped to climb convinced Spock that Kirk was trapped inside the body of that alien. Mr. Sulu, I will need a squad of security men in 15 minutes. We are beaming down to contact that alien at our earliest opportunity. Spock ordered his team to beam down out of sight of the creature. He was taking no chances. Even if Kirk was inside the creature's body, he would not expect the group from the Enterprise to greet him as he crawled the last centimeters over the lip of the canyon. By the time the landing party was assembled, the crab-like being had almost reached the top of the cliff. Spock found the first sight of the alien unsettling, like a dull toothache that did not seem to belong to any one tooth. Except for its size, the alien resembled a king crab with an outsized body perched on top of long, stout, segmented legs. The carapace was translucent, but blotched with purples and blues that shifted from moment to moment. The eyes were similar to human eyes, with central pupils surrounded by magenta irises, but they were mounted on stalks that allowed them to swivel independently. The creature pulled itself over the edge of the cliff and staggered to its feet. For a moment it just looked around, its color shifting to a deeper, more uniform blue. It did not notice the Enterprise's landing party. It turned away from the humans and started uphill, moving at a deliberate pace. Spock extrapolated its heading. Unless he completely misjudged the alien's intentions, it was headed toward the artifact. Spock to Enterprise. 12 to beam up, with the first contingent returning to the planet immediately. We wish to materialize 100 meters uphill of the alien, in a location where he cannot miss us. Kirk dragged his Kalikt body over the top of the cliff. He gave himself a moment to collect his wits after the climb. The Kalikt lower brain, he sensed, was almost incapacitated from terror at what he had forced his body to do. The best thing for this internal warfare, Kirk decided, was to keep his body moving. He checked the area for signs that the enforcers had been there. After a moment's confusion, Kirk realized the Kalikt had originated that thought. His host was still convinced that his society's equivalent of the Gestapo was after him. After a few minutes, as his host's brain decided that no enforcers or any other Kalikt were in the area, it began to relax and to move his legs with greater coordination. When the bipedal creatures appeared directly before him, the Kalikt brain seized with terror. His limbs froze in mid-stride, and momentum carried his body forward, pitching him ignominiously to the ground at Spock's feet. Mortified at this betrayal, Kirk struggled to reassert control over his body. It was like trying to unravel a pile of wet spaghetti. Spock studied his tricorder readings with a familiar cocked eyebrow. Fascinating. This creature's physiology shows it to be totally unrelated to any known species in the galaxy. Kirk struggled to regain his feet, but discovered that his Kalikt brain had retreated from the reality facing it. Struggling to remain calm, Kirk tried to tap into his Kalikt awareness to discover the cause of this sudden catatonia. At first, random images and chaotic swirls of color surged through his mind. He realized that the bright abstract images filling his mind represented the Kalikt language. He relaxed and let the patterns flow through his mind, trying to follow the emotions that accompanied them. As the thoughts repeated themselves, Kirk deciphered the gist of how the crab-like aliens viewed the world. They considered themselves the pinnacle of life, the goal toward which the universe had been striving since its hatching. As they developed spaceflight and moved outward from their home world, their discoveries confirmed their belief in their superiority and uniqueness. Any beings that interfered with their expansion or contradicted their worldview were thoroughly and ruthlessly exterminated. The Kalikt firmly came to believe that they were the only intelligent race that had ever evolved or would ever evolve, and that belief became the foundation of their collective view of the universe. His host had been thrown into panic by the appearance of a lower life form that controlled technological devices. The Kalikt mindset was so fiercely xenophobic that Kirk could barely comprehend the intensity of its faith. To deny that other intelligent beings could exist, even when staring one in the face, went beyond the most outrageous limits ever conjectured by anyone in the Federation. That knowledge, however, did nothing to solve Kirk's current problem. How could he catch Spock's attention? Kirk felt inspiration strike. Fighting to contain his growing sense of urgency, he concentrated on the thought that Spock was a Kalikt. Hot, angry zigzags of red and black powerful symbols of rejection and denial surged through his brain. The Kalikt lower brain would not yield its prejudices so quickly. Spock's eyebrow raised even higher. Fascinating. The colors and patterns on the carapace are changing with a rapidity that suggests this is a normal function of these creatures. He ran his tricorder over Kirk's shell with the sensors only a few millimeters above the surface. Kirk wondered if Spock could mind meld with him to read his thoughts, but he was not sure if the physiology of the Kalikt brain permitted telepathic transmission. He had to establish communications quickly. He concentrated on talking to Spock and explaining to him who and what the Kalikt were. A soothing pattern of interwoven blues and greens washed across his vision. But he knew that adapting the Kalikt language so he could contact Spock was impossible. The Kalikt system of projecting shapes and colors on their translucent shells and the deep-seated imprinting of their language on their lower brains defeated his desire to write English letters on his shell for Spock to read. He needed a different approach. Suddenly, he knew what to do. If his lower brain projected designs on his carapace in response to his thoughts, he could alternate between two contrasting ideas to produce a message in old-style Morse code. The traditional SOS was a simple, repetitious pattern that would give him a chance to experiment with controlling the Kalikt physiology. His decision made, Kirk concentrated on the thought of communication until interwoven blues and greens swam across his vision. When the pattern was established in his mind, and he hoped reflected on his carapace, he summoned his anger and frustration at being trapped inside the Kalikt body. As soon as the white flare crossed his vision, he released the anger and focused again on communicating until the peaceful blues and greens returned. Then he called on his anger again, relaxed into thoughts of talking with his crew, and finished the S with a final flare of anger. The O was a little harder, requiring him to hold on to his rage longer and to time the intervals so that his dashes would be distinguished from the dots. Halfway through the O, Spock paused in his circuit around the crab-like Kalikt body. He stared at Kirk's upper back as though trying to remember some long-forgotten fact. Dismay washed through Kirk as he realized that Spock had not deciphered his message. Kirk started the message again, trying to make the transition in his thoughts as sharp and precise as he could. As Kirk began the third SOS, Spock registered mild surprise. Dot, dot, dot. Dash, dash, dash. Dot, dot, dot. SOS. Are you human? Is that you, Captain Kirk? An apricot haze flooded across Kirk's vision. Spock had figured out what had happened. Everything was going to be all right. Spock to Enterprise. We have located the captain.
Sulu here. What's the captain's status? We're not picking him up on our sensors.
That is correct, Mr. Sulu. The captain is being held prisoner inside one of the alien creatures. At present, our working hypothesis is that when our people passed through the artifact, it gave them the bodies of its creators.
Do you know when you will be able to reverse the process, Mr. Spock?
Negative, Mr. Sulu. However, I wish to communicate with the other aliens in order to correlate their information with the captain's. Please direct security to locate the other 4 creatures and guide them back to the artifact. If those 4 are our missing crewmen, they will understand what is being said to them, although they lack the vocal apparatus to answer.
If they can't speak, Mr. Spock, how are you talking with the captain?
The aliens communicate by changing the colors of their shells, Mr. Sulu. The captain has discovered a way to display messages using an old-style system known as Morse code. I fear that we must confine our communications to yes or no questions.
I understand, Mr. Spock. I'll pass that along to the security people.
Spock returned his attention to the captain. With so many unanswered questions, it was difficult to know what to ask first. Waiting for Kirk's responses in Morse code would make exchanging information exceedingly slow. Resigning himself to taking whatever time he would need to get his answers, Spock lowered himself to the ground. Crossing his legs, he pointed his tricorder at Kirk and began asking questions. The setting sun had painted the landscape with the colors of Vulcan's flaming desert. For the last half hour, Kirk's answers had been slower. Kirk's alien body was tiring. Captain, I shall analyze this information and discuss it with our science teams. By morning, I hope that we shall have some positive recommendations for solving this dilemma. Kirk signaled back good, his carapace flickering between mixed blues and greens and an apricot color that appeared several shades darker in the ruddy light. Spock signaled the ship. Enterprise, beam up the remaining landing parties for the night. Inform all scientists that we will hold a briefing at 2100 to analyze our data and to formulate a plan of action. Kirk watched Spock and the security guard dissolve into sparkling motes of energy. A cold breeze whistled across the hilltops, ruffling the dry, flattened grass where Spock had sat for the last several hours. The land had once been populated by millions of Kalikt who had looked like he did now, and who had thought and believed the same things as the being his host was patterned after. Even after Spock disappeared, it took half an hour for his host to recover from its catatonic retreat. Cautiously, he sent a message to his limbs, hoping they would respond after the long hours of immobility on the chilly hilltop. Soon he was able to work the adjoining appendages and had all 8 legs under his control. Kirk heaved himself to his pincers, thinking how tiresome it was to go through a warm-up routine every time he let his body remain motionless for more than a few minutes. The Kalikt must have evolved in a much warmer climate. As he started uphill, Kirk decided he needed food. He concentrated on the idea of eating a good meal. Given his host's reactions to his memories of different meals, Kirk decided the Kalikt had eaten their meat raw and with very little preparation. A vision swam before his eyes. He saw this land crossed with a network of closely slatted fences enclosing lush pastures carpeted with a variety of herbs and grasses. Each enclosure was stocked with rabbit-like creatures that nibbled on the succulent forage until they were plump and their flesh was flavorful and juicy. A hungry Kalikt walked out into the pasture and chose his meal by the herbs he wanted to flavor the meat. As one of the docile Nanthkin came within reach, it was impaled on a pincer that flashed out and swept the doomed creature into the air. The Kalikt sheared through the animal's spinal cord with its sharp, triangular teeth, shaped much like a shark's teeth, and equally useless for chewing flesh. Ducts in the upper tooth injected the still-living prey with a combination of fast-acting neurotoxins and digestive enzymes. Within minutes, the flesh began to dissolve, and the Kalikt sucked up the savory juices through its proboscis, much as terrestrial spiders fed on their prey. Feelings of intense pleasure accompanied the Kalikt's memories of catching and feasting on a squealing and twitching Nanthkin. Kirk was glad that he was not in control of his body at that moment. Since he needed food to survive, he hoped that his Kalikt instincts would operate without conscious direction if he found an appropriate prey. About midnight, Kirk looked around, trying to find somewhere to spend the rest of the night. After searching, he discovered a spring hidden in a small grotto halfway down the hillside. Below the spring was a brackish pool covered with a thick mat of algae. Both his human and his Kalik programming agreed on how revolting the pond was, but Kirk knew his body needed food to function. When he could not hold any more algae and water, he retreated into the grotto and settled himself into a sheltered niche. The confined space would conserve his body heat and make it easier to start moving in the morning. Because of the late hour, there were only 5 people in the Enterprise briefing room. Spock presided from behind the computer station. Dr. Call, still looking washed out and shaky from his reaction to the saldonic gas, was fiddling with a stylus as he paged through the summaries on his datapad. Lassiter was at Call's side, and McCoy sat opposite the 2 archaeologists. The chief biologist, Lieutenant Dara Niles, completed the group. Niles was a quietly competent woman of medium stature and with close-cropped dark hair. Spock opened the briefing. I presume everyone has reviewed our earlier findings. Therefore, I will begin by summarizing my conversation with Captain Kirk. McCoy's eyes glittered with skepticism. Are you sure it was the captain? Doctor, I conversed with the creature at some length and am convinced that the captain's consciousness is housed within the body of this alien. The captain's analysis, based on knowledge contained in his Kalik brain, is that his body was altered during reintegration to that of a Kalik. This is supported by the fact that his mass as a Kalik is, within acceptable error limits, identical to his mass when he entered the artifact. In the morning we will measure the mass of other Kalik to determine if this applies to them as well. McCoy snorted his disbelief but said nothing further. Instead, Niles rapped her stylus on the table for attention. My people have been analyzing the Carishian ecosystem, particularly with regard to the nutritional requirements of the Kalik. It is our conclusion that most, if not all, of the plant and animal species that provided food for the Kalik have either become extinct or have evolved, thanks to the fading sun, into something no longer recognizable. Since the Kalik rely heavily on pre-programmed information, we surmise that our people on the planet will face starvation within a very short time. Stunned silence followed Niles' announcement, but Spock made the only logical decision. Lieutenant Niles, please work with Dr. McCoy to determine how we can provide appropriate rations to our people. If no one has any additional information, this briefing is adjourned. For Kirk, morning brought if not answers, then at least the outline of a plan. Kirk realized Spock would never be able to contact the others who had passed through the artifact unless he changed himself into a Kalik. Only Kirk's overriding need to look after his crew and to prevent anyone else from becoming a victim of the Kalik technology had enabled him to surmount his host's denial that other intelligent races might exist. In all probability, the others had not been able to establish any contact with their lower brains or exert any control over their bodies. The best thing he could do to further their mission, Kirk concluded, was to locate the others and get them to return to the artifact. His decision made, Kirk set off to find the other Kalik. Locating them was easier than he expected once he got near the artifact because of the wide trails of flattened grass. Kirk chose a tract at random and set off. He approached the Kalik carefully, his carapace blinking a bright, dark pattern for attention. The other Kalik noticed him and stopped, its carapace flickering a question in muted browns. Parent? Kirk relaxed and let the Kalik lower brain translate his thoughts. Yes, son, I am here. Why am I hungry, parent? There is food back the way you came. You should retrace your steps until you find it. Anything you say, parent. The Kalik turned around and started back, his movements erratic from lack of food. Kirk watched until the young Kalik disappeared over the crest of the first hill, thinking that convincing him had been almost too easy. It took him almost an hour to find the next track. When he found the broad swath of flattened grass striking across the rolling hills like a superhighway on old Earth, Kirk felt a stirring of excitement in his clicked brain. He took a few steps past the trail, intending to search for the next Kalikt, but his body veered around and started to follow the strip of flattened grass. Kirk's lower brain forced his body to move at a vicious pace, as if trying to make up for lost time. The longer he followed the trail, the more agitated and aroused his host became. After several hours, the subject of his pursuit appeared on the horizon. A jolt of electrifying excitement shot through Kirk, and his Kalikt lower brain forced his appendages to move even faster than before. The Kalikt on the horizon was the most powerful, most beautiful, most terrifying creature he had seen in his life, and he could not reach her soon enough. With a dawning sense of horror, Kirk realized the Kalikt biology was in control. Like it or not, Kirk could only go along for the ride. In scraps and snippets, images of the alien landscape registered on Chekhov's consciousness. It was as if he had been drugged and then turned loose to wander on an uncharted planet. But Chekhov could not hold on, and he lost consciousness to the alien. When the other creature had approached, he felt intensely relieved to know that he wasn't the only one on this desolate world. He was even more relieved to learn that food, shelter, and others of his kind lay back across the hills in the direction of the sunrise. When he thought about it, he couldn't remember when he had last eaten. He knew the answer should be the first thing in his mind: the color of the Nanthkin's fur, how much effort it had taken to capture it, what rituals he had observed in conjunction with his meal. If he could not remember that, he was losing the colors and textures that defined his life and gave it meaning. When the transit frame appeared on the horizon, he almost turned around again. The elder had said that food and others of his kind lay in this direction, but even a fool knew that no sane Kalikt put food pens near a transit frame. In the dim past, thieves from competing cohorts had stepped through the frames, caught their meals, and disappeared before anyone detected them. Perhaps the elder had meant the food pens were beyond the transit frame. At first, he didn't even see the strange creatures swarming around the transit frame. His first look at the bizarre animals stopped him in his tracks. Never within the lifetime of his race had anyone reported life forms as deformed and appalling as these. They moved on 2 feet, like the arboreal fruit catchers in the tropical jungles of the homeworld. He studied the beasts, wondering if they were the food the elder had said was near the transit frame. After a few moments, he decided they were not edible. That left him with 2 choices. Their food supply was either beyond the transit frame or it was through it. Going through the transit frame seemed the better choice. This was not the master frame, so most of their supplies and equipment were probably not in this area. As he ran toward the frame, several of the beasts made noises and moved toward him. He was only a few lengths from the frame when 2 of the creatures moved in front of him. Chekhov's host could not have stopped, even if he had wanted to. He shifted his course slightly, aiming straight for the largest animal. The soft, deformed body went down under the impact, its alien flesh deforming satisfactorily beneath his pincers. Chekhov's host charged through the portal without waiting to see what happened behind him. The Enterprise beamed up the wounded security guard and rushed him to sickbay. He was bleeding from several deep puncture wounds. Shaking his head at the damage, McCoy refused to let Spock interview the patient and took the guard into surgery. It took Spock 15 minutes to sort through the Enterprise's orbital altitude scanner logs. The Kalikt had materialized halfway around the world, in an area with no evidence of any Kalikt transit frames or other Kalikt ruins. Spock went back to searching for more Kalikt artifacts. Half an hour later, a movement on the monitor caught his eye. Kirk was hurrying after the largest Kalikt as if it were the most important thing in his life. However, What had attracted Spock's attention was a different scene, that of a small Kalikt trying to descend a vertical cliff. Its movement seemed intent and purposeful, as though it were searching for something. With cautious movements, the Kalikt picked its way over a pile of rubble and crept across the treacherous surface of an ancient landslide. On the far side of the crumpled ground, a trail was carved into the canyon wall. It suggested to Spock that a major Kalikt site must be concealed nearby. He sent the remote closer to the canyon wall, scanning the layers of red sandstone and gray limestone. Most of the way down, nearly hidden beneath a massive landslide, Spock found the unmistakable signs of long-deserted alien habitation. A small hole was the only part of a broad, arching ceremonial entrance that was unblocked by fallen rubble. Spock found remnants of the decorative carvings that had surrounded the entryway. Some of the vandalized scenes showed alien prisoners being slaughtered on low, blocky altars, while others showed graphic and violent depictions of Kalikt in contorted positions. Spock directed the remote to report what lay inside the opening. At first, the readings were confused. One moment, the sensors reported a huge cavern, large enough to hold the Enterprise with room to spare. The next instant, there was only solid rock from the cliff face back as far as the sensors could penetrate. Spock ordered the landing party to report to the transporter room in 15 minutes. Spock and a security guard were first to materialize at a safe distance from the rocks that buried the entrance. Spock edged his way across the rocks and reached the opening. Some of the carvings still bore traces of bright pigment. The fragments of the scene depicted a ritual sacrifice. The eviscerated, flayed, and dismembered bodies of half a dozen non-Kalikt races were spread across stone altars, reminding Spock of the Aztecs' brutal sacrifices of their captives. Pulling out his torch, Spock worked his way into the opening. Inside, the rubble spread across the floor of what had once been a large cavern. Now, fallen columns and slabs of rock littered the floor. A thick layer of dust covered everything. Conceivably, the last people to enter the room were those who had blasted the entrance shut. Spock eased himself back out and pulled out his communicator. Spock to Enterprise. Commence beaming down the science teams. The presence of a large cavern behind the rock slide is confirmed. We will investigate the site thoroughly.